All right, this is the final panel of the summit, and it has 0 lawyers on it. To my right are a panel of video game developers from the Chicago area, so we're just going to go down the line, starting with Kyle, and have them introduce themselves, and then we'll get to some questions.
Yeah. So I'm Kyle Bailey, and I'm a lead programmer at Phosphor Games. I've been working in game development for almost 10 years. I help with various events. The thing that I do mostly is a developer meetup, just like a social industry night type thing, which all of you are invited to if you'd like to come and meet lots of different developers. Speaking to that last point of getting to know your developers, you could come out and do that. Actually, obviously, you guys come out. So, yeah.
I'm David Lasky. I do a bunch of freelance work with some studios around the city and just various people online, and then also am a co-founder of a studio that me and a few people that we went to DePaul and we graduated and formed a studio called The Amiable. We're working on our first commercial project called Tetrapulse. I also help organize one of the newer local biannual events called BitBash with Ryan, and Kyle helped out with that too. And just kind of really involved with games, making games, harboring communities for making games. And I also started teaching at DePaul recently. I'm a programmer too.
I'm Cindy Miller. I am a designer at Culture Shock Games. I used to work at Wide Load Studio, which was the Disney-owned studio here in Chicago. I've been in games for about 6 years now. I'm a designer on our current game is We Are Chicago, which is like a social game about the south side of Chicago and some of the issues that are going on. Myself and Sarah are co-founders of Voxels Group, which is a Chicago women in games and game devs groups. And that's about it.
My name is Sarah Sexton. I'm a full-time employee at Microsoft. My role is as a technical evangelist, but video games are my passion. So I ingrained myself as the best I could in the indie community here in Chicago. I got a degree in computer science and a minor in communications from Central Washington University up in the Pacific Northwest. I recently moved down here about 6 or 7 months ago, so it's been a wild ride. I've never been to Chicago, and I don't know anybody here except for who I've met in the last 7 months. So I am also a programmer. I've published a game, so I guess that makes me a game developer. And as Cindy mentioned, I'm a big advocate for getting more women involved in science, technology, engineering, and math, including our effort through the program called the Voxels. And I also run a blog called SheBuildsGames.com to try to highlight the positives of women who make games.
Hi, I'm Ryan Wiemeyer. I have a game studio called The Men Wear Many Hats, and our most famous game there is called Oregon Trail, which is a parody of the original Oregon Trail. I highly recommend you download it right now. I also run a nonprofit called Indie City Collective, where I run a co-working space on the north side, and it is also the company that runs BitBash, which is a big game festival that, as mentioned before, David and Kyle helped me with, and a lot of other people. Pretty much the entire indie community runs that festival. I used to teach DePaul. I think I might be done with that. I do a lot of other things that I already forgot. So, yeah, games.
All right, so let's start with your experiences at work. How would you describe your relationship with the people at work? Do you have any contracts? And if so, when do those contracts start?
So I primarily do contract work, so I guess. Usually it depends on the person. If I'm familiar, like most of my contracts or jobs have actually come through Twitter. Like I'll just be talking with someone on Twitter. Not that the actual contract is a tweet. That is not legally binding.
40 characters.
Legally binding tweets, yeah. No, but most of the opportunities I've found is just through discussing with other developers online, in which they will email me later and then be like, hey, do you actually want to work together, help me on this project? And depending on how well I know them is kind of how immediately or forced it is about when we get a contract in place. We usually discuss like pretty upfront how much like compensation is and such. But as far as actually signing something, if it's someone I trust and know, I don't mind starting on the project of like not too long before a contract actually gets in place. But there have been cases where someone I've had a contract with at one point will like verbally discuss something about like terms of what I'm doing for them, and they'll pay me the money and I'll do it, and then it's just like, oh, we never had a contract for that, did we? So there's some times where it's like very lenient if it's with friends. Maybe it shouldn't be that lenient at times, but it varies depending on the person.
Speaking as someone who's currently contracting David, I hate giving people money, and I'm very controlling, so I like to be like, oh, I can do everything by myself. So generally the only time we get to a contract is when someone has like forced me to realize that my time can be better spent somewhere else, or that they're really good at what they do and also really cheap. And so for us, again, it's kind of what David said, where usually there's like a trial period where we kind of just like work together on stuff. And I'm very aware that you're supposed to have a contract before you ever release the game, and the sooner you get it, the better. But it's like, you know, the closer you are to the person, the less you care about it. So when you're an indie and you have very little money, it's really kind of, you got to like feel it out. Like whoever cares the most is the one who determines when that happens. And for us, even most of the time, we don't really have, I mean, our contracts are like napkins with like a signature line at the bottom. Like they're really crappy. But, you know, as long as everyone gets paid, no one ever seems to care. And we can do that because it's so small scale. But like as we start to grow, we have to start taking these things more seriously, which is kind of where we're getting to now.
All right, so for those of you who have experience working for someone else, how do you separate your work and personal projects, or do you separate these projects? I know, Cindy, you've transitioned from a big company to working on your own project, so has that changed how you deal with different projects of your own versus work projects?
Yeah, I found that there was a big difference from working with a big company where it was their game, and you're like, I go to work, I work on their game, I go home, and I can work on my own. When you're a lot more personally invested in a project, you're a little more, I guess, passionate about it. And so you spend a lot less time on your own personal things versus like what you're contracting for, or a game you're like a co-founder for. So it has been very hard to work on my own personal projects and not what I'm contracting for. And I'm not sure if there's a really good answer for that, because it's something I'm still struggling with. Because one hand, you want to, you know, do your own creative ideas and work on the projects you want to work on. On the other hand, you still want to eat and have a place to sleep. So kind of like you have to get motivated to be able to put all your time towards both projects, and that might not leave a lot of time for other endeavors.
I was just going to say, this comes up a lot with younger developers nowadays, especially because they want to be able to work on things at home. But a lot of times, if you're working for a large company, that company will say that they own all of basically everything that you do while you work for them. And I think that probably shouldn't keep people from working on things at home, mostly because it's unlikely you're actually going to make anything that company will care about. Which sounds a little bit harsh, but it's like if you're thinking to yourself like, well, I don't want to do anything at home because they might own it, and so you just never go home and you never learn anything new or different, it's just a detriment to yourself, which I'm not sure if that's really answering the question, but so lots of people work on projects at homes in the game industry, even though they're technically their company may or may not own it, and it ended up being something kind of like a ask for forgiveness type of thing, if it ended up ever being anything interesting, or like you quit and then publish the game if it's like your
So
thing.
Microsoft has a moonlighting policy. So when the question is, do you separate work and personal projects? My personal experience, I haven't bothered trying to separate them because it would have to be developed without using any Microsoft hardware that's provided to me, not on Microsoft's clock, without any of their supplies, facilities, or trade secret information. It can't relate to Microsoft as a business, and it can't be anything tied to Microsoft research and development. So I would just have to sequester myself in a monastery and chisel it on a stone and tablet in order to make it my own. So the only thing I've made so far, Microsoft can have it if they want it. But the other picture is, does Microsoft care about my IP? Probably not.
Probably
Yeah.
wasn't one of those, like, one of the things he was doing earlier, like, do they know about it? Do they care? Like, does it, whatever. Like, it's probably never going to get to stage 4 or whatever, so.
Yeah. So in my experience, actually, the game that launched my indie studio, I was working on while working for another large company that had been bought by an even larger, stricter company. And kind of the internal policy was like, just don't talk about it and don't work on it here. And then eventually it got to the point where it was becoming too problematic to keep it under the rug because I was trying to launch with it. And so eventually I just quit, which was, in 90% of the cases, is a bad idea. But I got lucky and it made money. And on my exit interview with that big company, I was like, yeah, your policy on working on stuff at home is like ancient and atrocious. And they're like, yeah, we keep losing a lot of people to that. And I was like, oh, she's like, yeah, I can't do anything about it. I was like, all right, bye. So.
That's actually one thing that's kept me a contractor is not that the few places that I've worked for that have expressed interest in me pursuing like a salaried position are usually pretty flexible about that kind of stuff. But overall, I just like the freedom of being able to jump around, and I do like collaborating and working with a lot of people, whether it's one person, like your studio is 2 people working with just you guys, or a bigger studio. It's nice to have the freedom to move around, and so I work from home on my own personal projects and my contract work, so that those areas blur a lot. And some of the work I do on contracts, they're like, yeah, feel free to use it in your own projects too. So that also, like, as I work on stuff for them, I also keep my own projects in mind for like what I can repurpose and reuse. And so there's some gray areas there too. But again, it's much different when you're working with a 2-person company versus kind of like a black box of administration and just like, here's a paycheck, do this thing. Whereas it's kind of like, let's work together, let's have a much more like intimate conversation.
It's more like collaborative when you're small. Mm-hmm. By the way, we own everything you ever make.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that binding?
Yes.
If you tweet it, it's binding.
Thanks for the legal information
Yeah.
from the non-law panel.
Yes.
In terms of marketing or discussing a current project, how early do you start talking about your game, and what do you talk about? And if you wait to talk about it, why? Have you ever been concerned about someone stealing a game idea? Have you ever been concerned about it failing, so you don't want to get information out there? How do you approach the marketing aspect?
I think the scariest thing for indies is to overpromise too early. Sometimes, like, you're like, I got this great game idea, and it's this huge thing, and then if you're lucky enough that it blows up, you then have this expectation. Like, is anyone familiar with the game No Man's Sky? Okay, it looks gorgeous. I'm sure they're doing a great job developing it, but that game has so much hype. Like, I would be shocked if they were able to maintain that hype and expectation on the same plane of, like on the same level. And so they have like huge promises. They're not huge promises, but huge expectations for themselves. And I'm always afraid to like announce anything about our game that I'm too like really excited about feature-wise, because then almost not even from a legal standpoint, but more of just a consumer aspect of like, Jesus, there's like so much like on my shoulders to make this exactly how millions of different people with different preferences and views on how games should be played want it to function. So it's almost more about not trying to overhype your audience. Not as much worried about people cloning it or something like that. If your game's on a larger scale, the larger the game, the harder it is to kind of clone explicitly. But we haven't had to worry about that too much so far.
So this is the thing I worry about a lot, because a lot of our peers have released like a Flash version of a game, which is like a smaller website version, and then in the process of porting it, since they're only a 2-man studio, they get screwed over by a clone who, is like some studio that throws like 15 people at it for a weekend, and they get it right out the gates. And so I worry about this a lot, and my students worry about this a lot as well. And generally what I try to tell them is that like you can't live in fear. Jerks are going to be jerks, and it's ultimately better for your game to get exposure and feedback throughout the entire process. And the more public you are about it, the easier it is to point at someone else and say, hey, these people just screwed us over. Don't buy their game and please support us. And that generally has proven to be a pretty good strategy. It's not perfect, but it's the only one that like makes it easy to sleep at night and be able to share your creations. And the way that I always think about it, because we've had multiple people try to clone some of our ideas, is that like your expression of the idea is always going to be pretty unique, especially the bigger it gets. And as long as you're confident that you can make this idea the best, generally the market will represent that and that you'll get the most money. Not always, but it's just what I tell myself so I can sleep.
I work for a little bit of a larger studio than these guys, and So, and most of our work comes through contracts with big publishers. So we'll have like anywhere between a 5 to 30 person team working on something, and that's certainly a small developer. But the point was just that it's bigger stuff with contracts with external companies. And as I'm sure most of you know, big companies with IPs and all that, they kind of have their like PR engine and their marketing machine and all that stuff kind of do all of this for you. So that's kind of planned into it. One thing I wanted to mention that we may or may not do, I would not like to say that I do any of these things, but or that any of us do these things, but we have this thing called the FriendDA, which I can't imagine it anywhere would ever hold up for any kind of anything with law words that might make sense inserted back into what I just said. But basically, within the development community, you might show games that you would not otherwise be able to show to non-developers because those people are willing to do that with you, and you just have this agreement that you won't talk about that outside of the feedback for that game while it's in development, if that game is tied to a publisher that will have an NDA. Like I said, I may or may not do this, and I will not confirm or deny the existence of it, but that's something that happens within the development community. So a lot of games that you find out about, say, that just came out now, like developers have been seeing those games and giving feedback for them for potentially months and weeks and years, and depending how long it took to develop it. So, yeah.
All right, so the game development community in Chicago is pretty close, as indicated by the fact that you're all working together secretly. So does that impact game development styles here? Does it impact how you handle work, who you look for, what qualities you look for in the people you contract with, or anything like that?
I personally only like to hire local as much as I can, because I do feel like our community is always struggling, and any step up we can give it, the better. And just same thing, I'll try to hire more women because we don't have enough women, and just stuff like that. Like as someone who has the option to, I don't want to say create jobs, that makes me sound like an adult. I do like to promote the community that's immediately around me that I see as constantly growing. And then on top of that, we all hang out. I hate to swear, there was a meeting, some sort of game event every day this week, and we all see each other all the time. And it's a really big campus called Chicago. And we just bounce ideas off each other, and we collaborate a lot, and we do game jams where we intermingle, and just all sorts of stuff like that. And I think it absolutely influences us. A lot of people have asked me why Chicago? Other than the fact for me it's just because I live here and everyone I know is here. But what makes Chicago different from everywhere else? And my answer is always that we're very practical. We don't have as much of an experimental scene. We don't really have angel investors, and those are kind of the two extremes of other places. And so when we make a game, generally it's to make a product to make money, and we all kind of. I've noticed we've got kind of a group think on that throughout the entire city. I think it's because we need money. And since no one's giving it to us, and we can't experiment and do something that might not make money, there's a lot more of this practical sense. And I want the other things, but that's just what I've noticed locally. What our culture seems to be slightly different.
I mean, the events thing is pretty huge. DePaul and actually mostly just DePaul, but I imagine hopefully soon some of the other schools will join in. They have events and they invite all of us out to see their students and see what their students are making and all that stuff. And what ends up happening when you see all these people all the time is you're like, hey, aren't you a programmer? Don't you need something to do right now? Because I have something for you to do. And it's kind of like your Twitter example. It's you can trust the people that you hang out with and that you know. So it tends to, I don't know, I'm looking up at you. I'm answering your question.
Yes.
But yeah, so it does. It influences it absolutely, and a lot of it is just it just makes more sense. It's an obvious thing, like Ryan said. These people, you trust these people, so you absolutely want to hire them to help you make things because you know they're going to do the job well.
I just like to clarify. Since game development's become a lot bigger of an industry, and there's a lot more schools offering, degrees for it. A lot of times if you find someone online that you don't really know very well, you're not exactly sure how much experience they've had, or if they've worked on a game before even, because everyone likes to say that, oh, I'm a game designer or I'm a game programmer, but they might not have actually shipped a game yet. So I think a lot of what our community offers is that you get to know these people, and you get to know who is actually shipped games, what kind of work they've done, and how they've worked with other people, which is, for a small indie team, very important, because you want to be able to get along with everyone and communicate effectively.
And at the same time, even though like maybe there's not the large like, again, I haven't hired anyone. I've just been hired for things. At the same time, as much as there is this kind of like knowing each other and kind of being familiar with each other's experiences and such, I feel like Chicago is also a really good community for people to get into games with, even if they haven't shipped something. Like the barrier for entry on getting involved with the community is just showing up a lot. Like if you haven't touched games before, if you've never programmed a thing, or like maybe you played Mario, or maybe you just learned who he was today, you can like just show up to like one of the meetups, and it's pretty welcoming. At least from, I would like to think we're a pretty welcoming group of. There's like at least 100 people who seem to show up to these things consistently. So. I
mean, for We Are Chicago, I think the max contractors we had on the project was 10, which is kind of a lot for an indie project. And I think about 2 or 3 of them have been people who hadn't actually shipped, but since we knew them and we'd seen what they were, what they could do as far as art or design, we were able to know that, hey, like they are serious about this. We know who they are. We can vouch that, there's not just like a liability, I guess.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, it's really cool even if you haven't shipped a game.
Yeah, and the first contract that I got that was related to games, again, it was through a conversation on Twitter where I had been actively using a game engine called Unity for like 2 years at the time, and I got in a conversation with one of the programmers at a studio, and they were like, "Hey, we need someone to help with like our PlayStation port." I had never done that before. I had never handled the dev kit or anything like that before. And though, again, it was like you have the competency and also the accessibility, because I'm sure someone who's been doing this for a lot longer than me would charge a lot more than I do. So at you find the sweet spot there, and again, you find people who, again, show competency, and you find yourself collaborating and working. And you just kind of make it work with the people you know, and then who you learn about as you continue to just like seek out new people and see all the cool things that people are doing.
So, as Ryan mentioned, there's a push to get more women into tech. So, what are the best avenues to get women into tech?
So, I think one of the first things would be for companies that can hire to hire more women, because if you have them hired, then they're technically in tech. So.
The second thing to do would be hire women into management positions within the gaming divisions, because it's fine to have more women at the entry level, but there are also mid and high level women out there looking for jobs.
After hiring people, one of the best things you can do is create a environment where they want to stay. So you hear kind of some horror stories about studios, which were basically boys' clubs, and I can imagine that any women who were hired probably didn't stay around too long if they didn't feel welcomed. So if you're a company and you're wanting to hire and keep women on as employees, then make it a welcoming place, make it a professional place. Don't make it I guess, what would be a good term for it?
Uninviting.
Yeah,
Like
don't make it
demeaning
uninviting. Yeah.
Yeah, there's the leaky bucket analogy of you can hire women all you want, but if you can't get them to stick around, then it's not really going to help the problem. It's like trying to fill a leaky bucket. So as Cindy said, having your workplace reflect values of equality is crucial. Make sure that there's equal pay between men and women, and equal rights between men and women for all genders.
Like this can be like, vacation time or maternity leave sort of thing, paternity leave. Yeah. So in light of stuff that's happened recently, providing like a zero tolerance harassment. So like have a policy in place so that people know that you're not going to accept harassment and that it's not part of the game industry, or at least your game studio. Or if you're independent, then it's not part of your project.
And I would encourage women to educate themselves for the battles ahead that they will face if they join a technology corporation. Read up on micro-harassments and interruptions that are just inevitable, and educate yourself for the battle that you will have ahead, so that you can just prepare and People will interrupt you when you talk, and people will cut you off, but you have to just steel yourself for that. Something that bigger corporations can do in addition to hiring women and all the stuff we've talked about was sponsor gaming groups, sponsor women groups, sponsor women in gaming groups. Stuff like that would be a big help because the big companies have the budget and the time and the equipment to put towards those sort of things.
And this, I guess, is a final note, because there are some smaller companies too, or just independents. Don't give up if you're a woman in games. The hardest part, I think, right now is to see all this stuff going on in the media and be like, do I want to go through that? Like, if I start being vocal, do I want to invite that kind of harassment? And I think the more women who are vocal and are getting out there and saying like, hey, I'm a game developer, I'm making these games and I'm passionate about that, I think it'll make other women realize that they're not alone. I think it'll make younger women who are thinking about coding and designing and getting into games to be more inspired, and then start local gaming groups or find local gaming groups. Like we started Voxels for that reason. We wanted a safe space in Chicago where we can meet and talk and design and make games. So I think those are all very important to keeping women in the industry.
And I would like to follow it up as well by saying, like, obviously we have a lot of communities here, and we try to, I'm sure we can do much better, but we try to do things like at BitBash, we have a safe space policy that we try to shove in your face as much as possible to let people know, like, hey, we are aware of this, and if you're being a jerk, we're going to kick you out. We can do more forward-thinking things like having unisex bathrooms and all sorts of stuff that, like, if you're a community manager of any sort, just, like, thinking about these things and sharing it with people just lets people know, like, oh, this is a place where I can't be a jerk. And other people know, like, oh, hey, I might actually want to come out to this event where I might not have thought I was welcome. And that's very important to me.
One note, there was a GDC talk this year. It might be up on the Vault or on YouTube. I'm not sure. But it's basically just a talk about how, as a community organizer, you can create a safe space. There's some way, I don't know how to find the URL for it, but if you can just Google it, GDC Talk Safe Spaces, you'll probably find it. It's really good.
And get your little daughters and little sisters and nieces, buy them engineering toys, buy them Legos, buy them building blocks. Don't give them dolls. Give them something that can do something. We got to start young.
There's also groups like Girl Develop It. I'm trying to think of some of the other local groups too, but they do a lot of like free workshops and such too that encourage. Isn't Code and Cupcakes another one? I think that's local.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really good groups that are encouraging women to get into development. And also as men, we just need to make sure that there is like an equal respect policy and that you don't like talk down to someone about like, or like assume a level of knowledge based on gender or any other kind of like type of diversity that might be involved just because like of, like just all the social stigmas that come from a position like that men have established in tech. We really need to break that. And so making sure that there's like an equal level of respect across learning and spaces and like environments, just in general, yeah.
As a lead over at Phosphor, I spend a surprising amount of time telling people to not be douchebags. What seems like normal people who are generally very nice seem to think that it's okay to do certain things as soon as it comes to someone's features that don't make them a straight white guy, which baffles me. So just in terms of, I forgot the word, but trying to help move this along, the part that I can help with is, telling these people like, hey, what the heck?
The journalism panel touched on these issues earlier, so I'd really like to talk about how you guys interact with journalists. I know you said that you reveal your games to other developers early on in the process, and journalists are obviously involved, but in what sense?
So I have a big list of emails, and I spam them when my game comes out.
Only when your game comes out, not before?
No, so, I mean, like, the local ones, you try to be, like, friendly with, because you want them to, like, remember who you are. And if I weren't split amongst a million other tasks, I would probably do a little more work maintaining relationships and sending preview builds and stuff like that, but it is actually a ton of work. Like, that's a full-time position. But yeah, I mean, generally it just like comes down to like seeing them at events and being like, hey, how's it going? And then, like, by the way, I'm doing something cool. What do you think about it? Do you want to? Is there a story there? Is that interesting to you? And I find that like generally cold emailing them is like way less useful. But on the flip side, like one time, just keeping yourself informed about the journalists if you're a developer is really important. For instance, the current editor-in-chief at Kotaku is Stephen Totilo, and right about the time he became editor-in-chief, I saw him like a week later. And I was like, hey, congratulations, blah, 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 and I knew things about him, and I knew what he looked like, and I was like, by the way, come check out my game. And like he just came over and like recorded me at my booth, and it was really weird because I went back home and looked at like Kotaku for that weekend, which was like a huge convention, and ours was the only game that they like had a video of. And I was like, well, that's weird. Did I like accidentally force him to do that? But I guess, I mean, that worked. You know, we got the publicity. So just being friendly, I mean, that's obvious. But yeah.
I was in a similar situation at the first Voxels Mixer, where we first went public and invited people to come check us out. We were in the Geek Bar Beta location, and there just so happened to be a anchor and reporter from Fox News 32, and since I'm the group's advocate, I took that opportunity to just walk up to her and politely inquire as to why she was in the same building we were, like what was going on. And they were just doing a segment on Geek Bar Beta as being one of the hot new places in Chicago. And I just asked her, since she was a woman, if she would be interested in doing a segment on a females in technology and gaming group. And her eyes lit up and she beamed and she said, yeah, that'd make a great story. So I just walked up to a reporter and a news camera and I said, hello, are you interested in us? And she just so happened to say, why, yes, I am. So that was lucky. Or maybe I took the courage to walk up to her when other people might not have said anything at all. But that was just being in the right place at the right time. And sometimes I wonder if I'm a journalist because I run SheBuildsGames.com, where I interview female game developers. So if I'm interviewing them and recording their questions and typing it up and putting it on the internet, does that make me a journalist? I don't know. Still working that one out.
I think engaging the press it's weird too, because our game is in this like where we finally like have the base of our game, and we're trying to like, we've been to PAX twice now, and we probably still have another year or so to go. So it's in a weird place to write about. It's kind of like, these people are making something and you can see some of it, but it's not done yet and this isn't final. So like, maybe check it out in a year. Like it's a weird place to be for engaging press. But just in general, keeping like in touch, because normally like right now we didn't get a lot of response from journalists at PAX and such, but some people did come and they wrote about it, which was nice. But it wasn't anything huge that we like boomed, and we weren't on any of like the huge sites. But definitely just being, like Ryan said, familiar with them, and basically keeping anytime your game has a big development, right? Like finding ways to make your game or your studio have like a story associated with it, or a new step in your journey or whatever. Like, oh, our game just announced like mod support or whatever. So now like players can, like, they've been playing the game for a year, but now they can mod the game or whatever. Like, even though your game's already been out for so long, that's a new development for that game. So you can kind of find parts in your development pipeline that are newsworthy and try to engage the press with those. Though you don't want to be like we upgraded from 1.1 to 1.00001. Like, cool, I fixed a bug. Like, no one's going to write about that. You need to like basically have these milestones or really important features that you would try to engage them with, so they don't just see you as like spam.
I'd like to say that traditional games press is actually becoming less important from a marketing standpoint, in my opinion. And so it's kind of pushing in two directions. One which is more interest stories, which is websites like Polygon, where they write kind of about the culture of games. And then there's the other direction, which is more directly related to marketing, in my opinion, and like sales, which is not really press, but it's like people playing your game on YouTube, and it's just called Let's Plays. And so actually YouTubers are going to have way more impact on your sales if they just play your game. And so it's actually becoming more important to pay attention to them and schedule meetings with them, and they're becoming kind of the new press. Like when I go to big conventions, those are the people that I talk to and seem to have a huge impact. And then meanwhile, I get on like websites that I read, like Kotaku, and it's like, blip. I'm like, oh, what the heck? So it's a really weird shift that's happening right now.
Just real quick. There's one, I don't know. So this is all, what they're describing essentially is marketing. Talk to press, so they will market your product for you, essentially. And I mentioned this earlier. I was talking to one of the guys that was on the journalism panel, and I can't see any of you. Like the press, there's this great part where if they like you, they will market your game for you, essentially. And then there's that part where they don't like you, and they give your game a low score, or they say bad things about your game. And that can like sometimes be like a make or break situation. So it's this strange, delicate balance of like, don't say the wrong thing, or not in even any way related to ridiculous things like Gamergate. I just mean like I don't know, be very nice to them and hope that they really like your game and give it a good score. That's great, good times.
All right. Since this is a law conference, I'd like to talk about when you consider your company's or personal legal needs, what they are, and if you could build the perfect lawyer, what would he or she look like? You're programmers, you know how to put things together. Let's do this. Anyone? Is that just a horrifying question?
I really liked during the last panel when they said don't bill them for every little minute, because I feel like there's a bunch of times where I'm like, I need to talk to the lawyer for like 2 minutes, but that's like, I don't have that money right now. Like, or like, you know, they'll bill you for some like roundup hour, or like, I feel like I'm totally lost in the realm of law, and there's all of these like very intimidating aspects of it, which was nice that something like this can happen because it kind of breaks down the barriers between the two. But just someone who's honest and affordable and understands that we're all just trying to pay rent, and like the reason we wouldn't go to a lawyer immediately is because there's things like cost and like that intimidation factor, right? I don't know. Did that answer the question?
What
was that just a
causes
thought?
the intimidation factor?
Well, it's just
Money.
Money.
So it's
money.
cost.
Like, oops, I messed up, $200 gone.
Yep. Yeah.
So why don't you go before you mess up?
No, I'm saying like, oops, I didn't need to talk to a lawyer about that. Like, I've
Okay.
heard a lot of horror stories of startups being like, yeah, and our lawyer cost us half of our budget. And like, when you're starting out and you don't have money, everyone's recommendation is don't talk to a lawyer, don't have one. Find a friend who will give you not advice, wink, because it's ultimately not going to be worth it until you've made money. You don't really need to worry about most things, because it's kind of one of those things like most people don't care what you're doing until you've made some money in the first place.
Security through obscurity.
Yeah. So I mean, so in my personal experience, generally, again, we have friends who don't give us advice, wink, wink, and we fell into a larger contract. And my crappy advice now is, if your contract is going to be making you over $10,000, or is like hiring your studio, it might be worth $200 to have a lawyer look over the contract. And we kind of got screwed by that, and we had to bring in a lawyer like after the fact, and that was more expensive and stressful. And it's like, and again, it's part of this like intimidation thing where it's like, okay, well, they're both speaking a different language, and they're telling me how much I'm getting screwed and what I can and can't say, and it was a huge mess. And my ultimate outcome from that was never take contracts again. So giving contracts is fine, kind of contracts, but like I was working for a larger studio, and that just like the legal side of it was a mess, and it's not worth it for me because I'm a small studio, and so like this doesn't make any sense for me. Like they lured me in with money and then screwed me with money. So
Any thoughts on what makes a good lawyer aside from affordability?
nice.
Saying hi in the mall thing
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah.
nice.
That sounded cool. I was like, I would like to have someone I could just call up and know that they know what they're talking about, and not have to just wink at all my friends in a circle for free. Like, you know, I don't know.
Circle winking is not the goal.
No, absolutely not.
So I think a big thing for Culture Shock Games is finding a lawyer that we feel is fair, because there is kind of a stereotype out there that lawyers are out to get you, and I'm sorry, but not trying to anger anybody, but we've seen some contracts which are really like, hey, we assume you don't know what you're doing, and we're going to try to take you for all you're worth. And finding a lawyer that we can work with that would approach it in a fair way, saying like, hey, we're not going to try to rob whoever we're kind of trying to contract with. We want it to be fair on both parties. Would probably be a big win for us, because then we feel a lot better and a lot more, I guess, positive about the whole like lawyer contract like situation and like relationship even.
Yeah, I've actually run into a lot of like things I had to sign where I'm like, that is terrible. And they're like, oh, just sign it. It's just precautionary. And I'm like, no, then take it out. And they're like, no, we can't do that because that's the form. That's the one we have. And I'm like, yeah, you really can. And I've had a lot of deals fall through like that. Like there was this one huge company that was going to ask us to make like a TV show into a video game. And we were like, okay, well, we're really cautious because we're a two-man studio and you guys like are a $1 million industry thing. And so they sent us an NDA at one point where any violation was like $1 million. And I was like, that will put us out of business like 8 times or more. Like, what? And they're like, oh, sorry, we'll send you a reasonable one. And I was like, what? This is nonsense. And so I was like, okay, we can't deal with you guys. And then the next contract they sent us was just like, okay, so we get to sue you for all these things, and we own your soul. And we were like, could you change any of those? And they're like, no. And so,
Super stressful.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like I feel like their lawyers are evil, which makes me really cautious about working with any lawyers, and that's probably where some of that stigma comes from. So it is nice, and the last one, at least, that I worked with, who said, here's all the ways they're screwing you. And I was like, oh, okay, I don't want to be in this anymore, because it's obvious from that initial contract that they do not actually care about me or want to write like a real contract. They want to cover their butts and cover their clients' butts as much as possible. And I would like someone that is like interested in both parties at the scale that we're at. You know, like it's generally like a human and a human, not like a corporation and a corporation. And it's got to be obvious in the contracts as well.
Yeah, that's why most of like the job. I haven't worked with a bigger studio than like 8 people, and even that was like big for me. So most of my work is like working with individual independent developers on finishing their product. And again, it's much more like if so-and-so's trying to screw me, I can look them in the face and say, why are you like this is absurd. And that hasn't happened yet because it's people I know or it's people I've talked to, and there's that level of trust to where the contract ends up not being full of like nonsense here or there, slipping in a clause that seems to be concerning. And if there is, it's an easily discussable conversation. It's not one of those things where you feel like you have to bring someone on or like pass it by like 10 people and be like, is this person trying to get something out of me? And you just talk through it. So.
Also, if they are really savvy, that's a good sign to me. Like, I was surprised at a dinner last night when someone's like, it's just JavaScript, and they got an i5 processor, and I'm like, dude, this guy knows what he's talking about. That's awesome.
Yeah, it would be good if a lawyer knew what iOS was, like you mentioned before.
As a lawyer, I'm not offended by any of that. But for the benefit of some of the newer and even older developers in the room, what is one legal fact, issue, whatever you want to call it, you wish you knew at the beginning of your game career that would have been really helpful to know at that point?
I would say, I don't know it's a fact, but the thing I said a minute ago, where like if your studio is if you're going to deal with a larger studio, and it's over a certain dollar amount, I don't know what that is for you, maybe it's $20,000, have a lawyer look at it. Like if their cost is going to be like 5% of how much money you're going to make, it's probably worth it to have them look at it.
I haven't really encountered any legal things yet. Most of the contracts are sent to me, and I say, okay.
I'm still at the beginning of my career, so I don't know yet.
I was telling the guy raising his hand in the back there, his friend came to town, and his advice was don't listen to game developers, get a lawyer. So I guess get a lawyer is probably the advice instead of listening to game developers who probably don't know what they're talking about.
Oh, we don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Wink, 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 wink.
Yeah, exactly.
Winking circles aren't effective.
Yeah, no.
I guess one other follow-up would be, and I don't know, I guess this is kind of a lawyer thing, but like when we first started making a lot of our contracts, we didn't know we didn't think through payments and stuff like that. So we had weird parts where it was like, oh, well, so this game's actually going to come out in another platform later. Do you still get money for that? And we just hadn't thought things completely through. And each time we write a new contract, we find something new that we messed up, generally related to payments. Of like, how long does it last? What platforms does it go to? Like if we go to a new platform, do we write a new contract, or is this one still good because we didn't say anything about platforms? And it's all been very it hasn't been a problem yet, but I always am wary of it. There's been several times where we're like, oh, well, let's just pay him even though the contract doesn't really say to, because it feels better to have him get paid. And I know that that's like not really great legal advice, so it's not actually legal advice.
Get a lawyer.
Yeah.
Get a lawyer.
I guess one thing, just putting my 2 cents in there, is like knowing like how you can protect your game, like copyright, trademark, like what can you actually do? Like it would have been a lot, I think, easier in some aspects to have known that beforehand, but even though that like that's something I should look into, would have been really good to have known before.
All right. Go ahead.
Hey guys and ladies. So I have kind of a two-part question. One is, what is your opinion on why there's really no big gaming expos here? And two, is BitBash, is the evolution of that kind of going to go that way?
Look at me. So personally, the reason I feel like there's not any big gaming convention is because Chicago's like conventions are super expensive and terrible and unionized in like a dangerous way. Like I once showed at C2E2 and I had to like move a piece of equipment, which is like a metal bar, like 2 feet, and they were like, okay, well you can't touch that. The union has to move that, and it's going to take 2 hours for them to get out here. And that was pretty much every like 5 minutes something like that came up, and it just got to the point where I had to start moving things and like breaking the rules, and it was super nasty. And just from everyone I've ever heard of that looks at Chicago, it's really expensive. Not to mention the convention centers are kind of like in like deserts compared to a lot of other cities I've gone to where they're like the epicenter of the city, you know. And then BitBash was definitely created. Kyle and I and a bunch of others were just like, why don't we have something like that? And so we just kind of started the one that we could. Because, you know, we were all just like volunteers and we don't really have money to throw behind it. And I don't think it's ever going to grow into that because most game conventions have a lot more money behind them and they actually make a ton of money. And I don't think we have enough to start that. I do think it will happen eventually. There's a lot of people that want that. I think BitBash is going to evolve more towards, say, like an Indiecade or I can't think of another one. But it's like a celebration of like interesting games. And conventions seem to be more consumer marketing focused, business,
like
money.
C2E2 and PAX are like a company goes to show stuff to these gamers.
Yeah.
This is like the developer doesn't have a booth. It's just being shown on the wall and you play it. You know, it's kind of a different format from that.
And they're possibly there if you want to hang out and talk and stuff. It's
but those companies are paying the organizers, the C2E2s and whatever. They're paying them a ton of money so that they can be large like that, whereas this, you know, they're not being paid. You know?
I think maybe probably in the next 5 years, something small might start. It might have to start, you know, just like a single day event with like 5 talks, because I think starting like from a conference standpoint would be a good place, and then expanding out to have like a show floor and whatnot. But I'm not rich enough yet, so if you guys just want to download my game, I haven't noticed anyone pulling out their phone. It'd be really helpful.
So I think one thing to add to that is that something that's been really interesting in the Chicago scene has been that the community has really come together in the last few years. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in the bigger studios, which has resulted in a lot of smaller studios, and now like the community is a lot more cohesive. And so there are a lot more events, and I think the only problem right now is that there are so many events, not everyone knows about them. So like there's the Midwest Game Developer Conference, which is being held right now in Wisconsin. We're trying to get it moved to Chicago, but all the the cost issues that are associated with that.
And the
but
union
not,
issues, yeah.
Yeah, and union issues. And like not everyone knows about these events. And so I think ChicagoMakesGames.com is something that's been new, that's been put up, where you can submit events to the website, and they'll post them being like, hey, there's all this stuff going on all the time. So like if you're Indie City Games, you can put your meeting on there so everyone will know about it. You can also, like, if you're BitBash, you can put the BitBash stuff on there so everyone knows, and there's one place to go for all the game events in Chicago. That's something that's been really, really, I think, useful for our community. So like we can actually find more developers, we can become more of a community, and I think that will help also get a big conference here, is being like, hey, there's a demand for it.
Another question? No? Okay, one more.
Hey, thanks for being here. I was just wondering if you guys could give a real quick bullet point rundown of how you go about developing from concept to shelf, like every step that would be involved, if possible, knowing there's probably some overlap, but is that something you can do?
Bullet 1, you do bullet 2, you do 3.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
There's a lot of different ways. There's not just like one way.
You're
But
talking about game development, right?
Yes, yes.
yeah. There's a lot of different ways. There's not just one way, but like a standard way, say like if you think of the way like movies work and stuff, someone's thinking about some kind of an idea that they have and they write down and they make kind of proposals and stuff from a bigger company for some kind of a contract that they give to someone like Phosphor. And there's like a little bit of planning, writing out documents, and this is what we think things are going to be and how things are going to work, and this fits here and this fits there, and these pieces, this is how they fit together, and everybody says like, yeah, do that. And then you send your team of programmers and artists and producers and designers, and they take basically each piece step by step and take it from that idea on a piece of paper to code and art assets and design things in a game with numbers and physics running and all that stuff. And you just like do that over and over again.
And over again.
And over and
I have
over
a
again.
clarification question for you.
Yeah. And then eventually, everyone decides like, okay, that's it, and then you like send it to the place where people will buy it, wherever that is.
Are you talking about following a tutorial and collecting assets and artwork that someone else has done and just sort of putting it together? Or are you talking about a 100% from scratch original piece of work?
100% from scratch, although, I mean, just kind of looking for a more, the question's pretty general, so.
Yeah, I think it's more so like Kyle was saying, there's a concept phase. You iterate a lot on your concept until you kind of find the diamond in the rough, or like you try a bunch of variants of it, and then you as a team kind of decide, or maybe you have like a creative director, right, or however your team decides to move forward in the process, and you just iterate and iterate each, like whatever department, or like I do programming for my team, so I do a lot of the code stuff. Artists kind of handle how they see the visuals working, and we talk about how that works, and they take care of it. And then there's a lot of hidden steps in there that involve marketing and lawyers and web assets and presenting yourself and making sure. I mean, it also depends on if it's commercial or not, right? Because I could just make something like in 24 hours and throw it up on a website and no one will ever know about it, and that's fine. Like if you just want to make a game, that's totally cool. But it kind of depends also. There's a lot of those steps that are almost like not optional that you forget about in the business category that end up bloating and taking a lot of time out of the normal development cycle, which for independent developers, that's a lot of the reason we don't end up seeing lawyers and seeing CPAs and talking to these people a lot, is because we're so bogged down in just the making process that we also have to deal with the marketing and the like legal stuff and all of that, and then we forget about it, and it's hard to, if you don't have someone dedicated to that position, to manage that properly.
Yeah, and in my personal experience, it's really hard to trust somebody else with those things.
Yeah, who's not involved actively with
Yeah.
your games being made.
It's like hiring someone to tweet about your kid, right? Like, that would be weird. Like, oh, God, you don't know my kid. Why are you talking about my kid to the public? That's mine, And so it's really hard to trust that with someone else. So then you get to the end, you're like 120% exhausted, and like, oh, wait, now I have to herald this. And then I think you just curl up in a corner, and then your game comes out. I don't know what happens.
As a smaller developer, I typically like to have like the iteration phase, like they talked about. I like usually go to like a paper prototype or some sort of way I can like start playing with it in like a more like visual way, and then I'll take an engine. So like I use Unity a lot, and it's really easy to like do some really simple stuff. So you can use that to prototype, and then from there you pretty much like just keep iterating on your prototype until the prototypes turn into the game, and then you try to, put it on whatever platforms you can, whatever makes the most sense for what your game is, and like at that point you're like halfway done, and then you have the rest of the half, which is like the marketing and like letting people know about your game, because there's so many people making games right now, and there's so many apps in the App Store, and there's so many games in Greenlight. Like you really need to spend pretty much half your energy on the game and then half your energy on like getting people to know about it, which is like conferences, conventions, tweeting.
Yeah, and if you need if anyone here actually wants resources for making games, feel free to talk to us. We can definitely help point you in a direction to start doing so.
Yeah.
I'll leave the 100% original creation to my panelists and colleagues here, but I actually have a literal bullet list of 10 milestones to make a first game, if you would like that.
Yeah, that would be great.
1, choose your program, such as Unity, and organize your folders. 2, collect assets and artwork, in this case, placeholder art's perfectly okay. 3, build a level environment and create prefabricated things that you could just copy paste cookie cutter style. Create your world. 4, add your player character. 5, create animations and write scripts for your player character to follow. 6, set up the camera the way you want to. 7, build user interface tools and heads-up displays. 8, calculate scoring points if scoring points is part of your game. 9, create your game over scene and your title screen and your start menu. And 10, publish it to the store.
That's great. Thank you. Is not to monopolize the mic, but aside from reviewing contracts, do you guys see anywhere on your kind of level and resources that you're operating with that attorneys could add value to any of the steps of that process?
Yeah. We don't have any internal sound person, and so we've contracted all of our sound stuff so far, and so we've had to have people or like consult people to write up our contracts for our different like sound contractors, and then do that. So yeah.
I think to add to that, we're right now licensing sound from artists who are living on the south side for our game because it makes sense. But like we don't really know much about music licensing, and there's like 2 different big publishers, but then you find some local artists that have like somebody who owns their music, and you have to go through them. So like having somebody who knows like the music scene would also have been very beneficial to us.
And I know with voice acting, there's like different unions and you can't mix, and there's a bunch of that stuff. So there's a lot of like little steps. Then depending on the scope and goals of your game, definitely it'd be awesome if there was a legal person who, at any point, you could consult for maybe 5 minutes, and like just as things come up. Same with a CPA, as things come up, it'd be nice to have someone to consult.
They would know the music, they know the contracts, they know
Yeah.
the patent, but
Yeah.
I think one of the other fears, though, is that, like, I just want to talk to them for 5 minutes, and it's going to blow up to be like 2 hours. That's why I'm like, I'm just not going to ask.
Yeah,
I think it
this
takes
is-
5 minutes, but once they tell me, okay, well, we're going to need to do 2 hours, I'm going to be like, never mind.
Thank you. Great information.
Thank you for the question.
All right, so I think that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much for coming. We will have the museum and this space open for another hour, and then at 7 p.m. there's an after party at Emporium, which is a barcade here in Chicago. So we'd love to see you all there.
Yay.